few years ago I built a dining table from some salvaged scaffold boards and fence posts. Since then I've learned a lot more about joinery and finishing, and I also have some much better tools now than I did then, so I decided to build a new one to replace it. So I took the old table apart and I'll reuse the wood from that for something else at some point. I wanted to make a table that looked a bit different, using a variety of contrasting types of wood as a bit of a feature, and I had some strips of mahogany and teak that I'd used previously to make the drinks coasters that I featured in a previous video. So I'd use those and a few other different types of wood that I've got stored in my workshop to make the new table. I also had 4 chairs that I recently salvaged from a local office clearance to pair with the table, so I wanted to make the table complement the colour of the chairs. The strips of mahogany and teak were 20mm square and had finish on 2 sides, while the other 2 sides were bare wood. So I began by running them through the thickness planer set at 18mm with the finished sides facing upwards to get rid of the finish and get all the strips to a consistent size. I only had about 8 pieces of the teak and 10 pieces of the mahogany, which wouldn't be enough to clad the whole tabletop by my calculations, so to make them go further I decided to rip them all in half lengthways on the bandsaw to give me twice as much stock. To get my blade as central to the wood as possible, I adjusted the fence on the bandsaw to position the blade centrally by eye, and then used a small offcut as a test piece. I started a small cut, and then by flipping the test piece by 180 degrees, if the blade was aligned with the cut I'd just made, then that would confirm that the blade was central. It took a few tweaks to get the fence set correctly. Rather than pushing each strip of wood through the bandsaw blade manually, I decided to set up a sacrificial fence on the bandsaw, using a scrap piece of plywood and a couple of clamps. I used another couple of offcuts as spacers to set the distance between the 2 fences, making sure that these pieces could move backwards and forwards but not side to side. I could then fire up the bandsaw and run each strip through one by one. To contrast with the mahogany and teak, I wanted to use something else that was light in colour to contrast with the dark wood. I looked through what I had and found a couple of pieces of rough sawn pine. I chopped them roughly to length on the miter saw, cleaned up the edge on the table saw, and then ripped the pine into strips with the table saw fence set to the same thickness as the pieces of teak and mahogany. With the pine ripped into strips, I then used the jointer to clean up one edge, and then set the thickness planer to 18mm to get these strips to the same width as the mahogany and teak strips. With all of the strips of wood prepared, I'd need a base to attach the strips of wood onto, so I looked through my collection of salvaged sheets of wood and found a sheet of 1/2-inch plywood that was basically an ideal size for a 4-seat dining table. It was roughly 1200mm by 800mm. Then I could begin gluing and nailing all of the strips to the piece of plywood. I positioned the first piece flush with one side and the end of the plywood. I used ordinary wood glue which I spread out with my finger to get an even coverage, and nailed these pieces to the plywood with my brad nailer. For the next strip I applied glue in the same way again to the back, but also to the side, and then applied pressure to squeeze the strip as close as possible to the previous strip before firing in the nail to minimise any risk of gaps between the strips. I started with mahogany, then pine, then teak, then mahogany, pine and teak again, and so on to create the pattern. This part of the project was by far the most time-consuming part. When I ran out of strips of wood, the tabletop measured 750mm wide, and I was happy enough with that size. My brad nailer doesn't always do a great job of firing in the nails all the way, so I came back with a nail punch to hit the nails just below the surface of the wood. With the strips attached, I could then cut everything to length. I used a pencil to make 2 marks at a length of 1200mm from the other end of the plywood, and then joined the 2 lines using a straight edge, which was a piece of wood in this case, as I didn't have a ruler long enough. Then I made the cut following the line with a handsaw. The nails I used to attach the strips of wood were too long, so they all poked through to the other side of the plywood. Rather than ordering new ones and waiting for them to be delivered, I just used what I had and used an angle grinder to cut them flush. This left a few grind marks, but I wasn't really bothered about how the underside of the table looked. Then I needed to trim off the edge of the plywood, and I decided to use my jigsaw for that. I nailed on a leftover strip of the pine just to use as a guide for the base of the jigsaw to ride on, to make sure that the blade was angled at a perfect 90-degree angle to the edge. And then I could clean up the edge with my hand plane. So unfortunately I lost a bit of camera footage at this point, so instead I'll talk a little bit about what I did next. I needed to do lots of sanding to the tabletop. I started with a 40 grit sanding belt on the belt sander to get all the strips of wood flush with each other and get rid of all the glue squeeze out. And I sanded perpendicular to the grain and also diagonally until all of the strips were as flat and as consistent as possible. The first sanding uncovered a few imperfections. There were some small gaps in between a few of the strips of wood. Luckily, I always keep a supply of both some dark and light coloured sawdust to hand, so I rubbed in some glue into the gaps and then rubbed in some sawdust, and I did that to all of the nail holes too. Now the nail holes in the tabletop would never be invisible once the table was finished, but I don't mind that, it all adds character. But the glue and sawdust would make them a little bit less noticeable. I then scraped off the excess glue and sawdust mixture with a cabinet scraper before it had a chance to set. Next I went to an 80 grit paper on the belt sander, this time sanding with the direction of the grain. Then I switched to an 80 grit paper on the orbital sander to get rid of any imperfections left by the belt sander, and then moved up to a 120 grit paper on the orbital sander. Finally I switched to wet and dry paper for some hand sanding with 240 grit, then 400 grit and finally 600 grit. I then wanted to make some trim for the 4 edges of the tabletop, so I went back to my collection of wood and found a piece of oak which a friend donated to me. I ripped the piece of oak into 15mm strips on the table saw and cut the ends at 45-degree mitre joints, and then these pieces were glued and nailed to the edges of the tabletop, flush with the top of the table, with a slight overhang at the bottom. Now, back to the footage. I chose Danish oil as a finish for the tabletop, which I've read is a mixture of boiled linseed oil and varnish, so it brings out the natural beauty of the wood, but is also more hard wearing than other oils, so it should do a decent job protecting the table from spills and heat. This particular oil was donated by a friend and it looks pretty old judging by the vintage looking Screwfix logo. I brushed this on and the wood started to look really nice. This was just a first coat and I applied the oil liberally and let it soak into the wood. Later I'll talk a bit more about how I finished the tabletop. Then I realised I forgot to bevel the edges of the oak trim, and I wanted to do that so that the edge of the table was more comfortable to lean on. Some people would probably use a roundover bit in the router here, but I'm not really a fan of how roundovers look, so I usually just give edges 2 strokes with a block plane at roughly a 45-degree angle to ease them over instead. Once I did that, I just touched up the edges again with oil.